I still remember the day I realized my husband had forgotten me. Not forgotten my face or my name. No, that would have been easier to bear. He had forgotten me, the woman behind the years, the one who stood beside him when everything was nothing. It wasn't a single moment, really. It was small things at first, the way he no longer looked for me at the dinner table, the way he said, "I'm tired," instead of, "How was your day?" The way his eyes glazed over when I spoke. Little silences that grew between us until they became walls. My name is Evelyn. I'm 58 years old. I've been married to my husband, Richard, for 35 of those years. If someone had told me when I first met him that one day I'd feel like a stranger in my own marriage, I would have laughed. Back then, I believed love, real love, never faded. But now I know love doesn't always disappear with a storm. Sometimes it just gets lost quietly in the middle of routine and responsibility. When Richard and I married, we had nothing. We rented a one-room apartment with peeling wallpaper and a window that wouldn't shut properly. But those days, those were the happiest of my life. He used to come home from work late, smelling of metal and dust from the factory. I'd have dinner ready, simple things like soup or rice, and he'd look at me like I was the whole world. We didn't have fancy dates or big dreams, just each other. I remember one night, he came home with a single rose. It was wilted at the edges, but his face glowed. He said, "It's not much, Eve, but one day I'll give you everything." And I smiled because I already had what mattered most. He was my everything. When our son, Michael, was born, life got harder but fuller. Richard worked longer hours, and I stayed home, caring for the baby. There were nights when I barely slept, when Michael cried for hours, and the bills kept coming, but I never complained, because every time I looked at Richard, I saw hope. He would hold my hand and whisper, "We'll get through this, Eve. We always do." And we did. We bought a small house on the edge of town. It wasn't perfect. The roof leaked and the floorboards creaked, but it was ours. I painted the walls myself, stayed up late sewing curtains out of old bed sheets and made it a home. Richard worked hard. He got promoted, then promoted again. And slowly our lives began to change. There were nicer things. A new car, better furniture, vacations once a year. We climbed the ladder we'd once only dreamed of. But somewhere along that climb, we stopped holding hands. I didn't notice it at first. It happened slowly, quietly. He stopped asking me to join him for dinner with his colleagues. He started traveling more, staying late at the office. At first, I told myself it was all for us, for the life he wanted to give me. But one night, as I sat at the table waiting for him, the dinner cold, I realized something. He no longer came home for me. He came home because it was expected, because this house, this life, it was what he'd built. And I was just another piece of the furniture in it. When Michael left for college, the silence between us grew heavier. I thought maybe, with just the two of us again, we'd find each other. But it didn't happen. We didn't fight. We didn't argue. We just stopped talking. He would eat his dinner in silence, watching the evening news. Sometimes I'd try to start a conversation. "How was your day?" I'd ask softly. He'd shrug. "Busy." And that was it. Some nights I'd lie awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, wondering if he ever missed us, the young couple who once promised to grow old together. The turning point, though, came one evening in early spring. We had been invited to a retirement dinner for one of his colleagues. I spent all afternoon getting ready, a blue dress, the one he used to say brought out my eyes. When I came out, he barely looked up from his phone. "Ready?" he asked flatly. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Do I look okay?" He glanced at me once. "Yeah, fine." That was all. At the dinner, he introduced me to people I'd never met. "This is Evelyn," he said without warmth. No, my wife. No pride. No affection. They smiled politely. I smiled back. But inside, I felt something break, quietly, like a thread snapping. When we got home that night, he went straight to bed. I stood by the mirror, looking at my reflection, the wrinkles, the gray streaks in my hair, the tired eyes. I thought about the years I had given him, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the love I poured into every corner of his life. And I realized he didn't see any of it anymore. He saw comfort, he saw familiarity, but not me. That night, for the first time, I didn't cry. I just sat in the quiet and thought about all the years I had spent making sure everyone else was okay. Him, Michael, our home, our bills, and how, somewhere in between, I had forgotten myself too. The next morning, I made breakfast like always, eggs, toast, coffee. He took his plate, muttered a thank you, and left for work. And as the door closed behind him, I whispered to the empty kitchen, "You're welcome." It wasn't anger, it wasn't resentment. It was the first honest word I had said to myself in a long time. In the weeks that followed, I started noticing all the small things I used to ignore. The way he scrolled through his phone at dinner, the way he forgot to ask about my day, my friends, my health, the way his affection had turned into habit, polite, distant, mechanical. But I also started noticing something else, the strength I still had, the quiet resilience of the woman who once built a life from nothing. I started going on walks again, planting flowers in the garden, visiting the library. I met people. I smiled. And for the first time in years, I didn't wait for him to come home before feeling alive. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. He came home early. I was in the garden, dirt on my hands, humming softly. He stood there watching me for a moment before saying, "You've been spending a lot of time out here lately." I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sunset. "It's peaceful here," he nodded, almost absently. "Dinner ready?" I smiled faintly. "It will be." He went inside, not noticing the tremor in my voice. I remember thinking, he doesn't even see how much I've changed, not just the flowers I planted, but the woman I was becoming again, piece by piece, quietly, patiently. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. I looked around at everything we had built, the furniture, the photographs, the memories frozen in frames, and I wondered, what happens when love forgets the hands that made it possible? I didn't know the answer then, but I was about to find out. The days began to pass with a strange stillness. The same routines continued, breakfast at 7, coffee before work, dinner at 8. But something invisible had shifted between us. The silence no longer hurt me the way it used to. It just sat there, like a companion I'd finally accepted. I began to live around Richard instead of with him. He had his world, his meetings, his phone calls, his late nights, and I had mine. Mine was smaller, quieter, but it was mine. Still, every once in a while, I caught myself watching him. The way he scrolled through his messages with that slight smile that used to be meant for me. The way he said goodnight without even looking up. And each time I wondered, how does love forget this easily? I wanted to ask him. I wanted to look him in the eyes and say, "Do you remember who I am? Do you remember what we were?" But the words never came, because something in me knew he wouldn't understand. One Sunday morning, I made his favorite breakfast, pancakes, bacon, and fresh orange juice. It was something I hadn't done in years. He came downstairs, looked at the table, and said, "Is someone coming over?" I smiled gently. "No, I just thought we could have breakfast together." He hesitated, then sat down. For a moment it felt almost like before, the sound of the fork against the plate, the smell of syrup, the sunlight spilling through the curtains. Then his phone buzzed. He picked it up immediately, smiling at the screen. I saw her name flash briefly, Melissa. I didn't know who she was, a colleague maybe, or a friend. But the way his face softened when he looked at that message, it wasn't how he looked at me anymore. He chuckled quietly, typed something, then realized I was watching. He looked up, his expression neutral. "Just work stuff." I nodded, pretending not to notice the lie. I continued eating in silence, my food cold on the plate. That morning, something heavy settled in my chest. Not anger, just the quiet confirmation of something I had already begun to accept. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew even more. I still cooked, cleaned, and did everything I always had, but my mind began to drift elsewhere. I started volunteering at the local library. It wasn't much, just shelving books, helping children pick out stories, but it gave me something to look forward to. I remember one afternoon, a little girl came in with her mother. She tugged at my sleeve and asked, "Are you a teacher?" I smiled and said, "No, dear, I just love stories." She grinned. "Me too. My mom reads to me every night." I nodded, but my heart ached a little, because once I had done the same, sitting on Michael's bed, telling him stories while Richard worked late. That was the kind of love that never asked for recognition. It just gave. One evening, as I was leaving the library, I saw a couple sitting on a bench outside. They were older than us, holding hands, laughing about something only they understood. There was a softness between them that made me stop. I stood there for a moment, watching, feeling tears gather at the corners of my eyes. When I came home that night, Richard was asleep on the couch, the TV still playing. An empty glass sat on the table beside a half-read newspaper. His phone buzzed once. I looked at it for a moment, then turned off the TV and covered him with a blanket. As I stood there watching him sleep, I felt a wave of sadness, not for what we were now, but for what we once were. It was like mourning a love that had died quietly, without a sound. A few days later, we had dinner with Michael. He was visiting from out of town, and I was excited. I hadn't seen him in months. We went to a small restaurant near his office. He hugged me tightly when he saw me. "Mom, you look great," I smiled. "It's just the lighting." When Richard arrived, he was his usual composed self, polite, formal, detached. Michael noticed it immediately. Halfway through dinner, he said gently, "Dad, do you two ever take a break? You both look tired." Richard chuckled. "That's marriage, son." Michael's smile faded. "It doesn't have to be." There was an awkward silence. I changed the subject, asking about his work, his apartment, his new projects. But the conversation felt different now. Even my son could see what I had been pretending not to. That night, after we came home, I sat by the window while Richard undressed for bed. The room was dimly lit, and the sound of rain began to tap softly against the glass. He looked at me once and said, "You were quiet tonight." I turned toward him slowly. There wasn't much to say. He frowned. "You're upset." I shook my head. "No, just thinking." He sighed and turned off the light. "You think too much, Evelyn." And just like that, the conversation ended, like every other one had before. I stared into the dark, listening to his breathing, and thought, he doesn't even realize what he's losing. A month passed. His trips grew more frequent, his calls shorter. When he was home, he was distracted, distant, always somewhere else in his mind. One evening, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket, a dinner for two at a restaurant we used to love. My heart stilled. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling in my hand. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I whispered to the quiet room, "So this is what forgetting looks like." He came home late that night. I had already prepared dinner, but I didn't wait for him. When he walked in, he looked surprised to see me awake. "Eve, you're still up?" "Yes," I said softly. "I wanted to talk." He hesitated. "Can it wait? It's been a long day." I nodded slowly. "Of course, it can wait. It's waited for years." He didn't understand the meaning in my words. He just kissed my forehead absently and went upstairs. And I sat there staring at the clock, feeling time slip through my fingers. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I packed a small bag, not because I wanted to leave forever, but because I needed to remember who I was outside of this house, outside of him. I left a note on the kitchen table. "Gone to visit my sister for a while. Don't worry about me." And then I left. The drive was long and quiet. For the first time in years, I turned on the radio and sang along softly to the songs. It felt strange and free. When I reached my sister's home, she hugged me tight. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "You needed this, didn't you?" I nodded, and the tears I had been holding for years finally came. The week I spent there changed something inside me. I laughed. I cooked with my sister. I told stories. I walked along the beach in the mornings and watched the waves roll in. And somewhere between those days, I realized how long I had been surviving instead of living. When I came back home, the house was quiet, but something was different. Richard was waiting in the living room. He looked tired, not from work, but from something deeper. "Eve," he said softly, standing up. "Where have you been?" I looked at him calmly. "I told you, with my sister." He nodded, then hesitated. "I missed you." It had been years since I'd heard those words from him. They hung in the air like something unfamiliar. "I didn't think you'd notice," I said gently. He exhaled slowly. "I noticed, more than you think." That night, for the first time in years, we sat together in silence that didn't feel heavy. He told me about his worries, his stress, his regrets. He said, "I don't know when I stopped seeing you, Eve. I just got lost somewhere." And as I listened, I felt the first crack of light in the wall between us. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become it. The next few days after I came home felt strange, like waking up from a long sleep and realizing the world had moved on without you. Richard seemed quieter, more watchful, almost unsure of himself. He didn't ask where I'd been beyond what I'd told him. He didn't demand explanations or defend himself. He just started noticing me, really noticing me, for the first time in years. One morning, I was standing in the kitchen stirring sugar into my coffee when he said softly, "You cut your hair." I looked at him surprised. "Yes, a few weeks ago." He nodded slowly. "It looks nice." I smiled faintly. "Thank you." It was a small moment, but after years of silence, even small moments felt like rain after drought. That weekend, he offered to take me out for dinner. It had been so long since we'd gone anywhere together that I almost said no. But something in his voice, a gentleness I hadn't heard in years, made me say yes. He chose a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. When we sat down, I noticed he had reserved a table by the window where the lights reflected softly off the glass. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Evelyn," he began, "I owe you an apology." I stayed silent. He continued, his voice low. "I know I haven't been kind or attentive. Somewhere along the way, I let work, stress, and pride take over. I thought I was building something for us, but I see now that I left you behind while I was doing it." I watched him quietly. His words were sincere, raw even, but the ache in my chest wasn't something that could be soothed by a single apology. "I used to think," I said softly, "that love was about standing beside someone through everything. But I learned that love also means seeing the person beside you. You stopped seeing me a long time ago, Richard. He nodded, looking down. I know, and I hate that I did. The waiter brought our food, but neither of us touched it. We just sat there, two people rediscovering how to speak to each other. That night on the drive home, the silence felt different, not heavy, just thoughtful. He reached for my hand on the gear shift, hesitated, and then held it gently. It was awkward, unfamiliar, but it was real. I didn't pull away. When we reached home, he opened my door, something he hadn't done since our early years. And as I stepped out, I realized that maybe, just maybe, he was trying. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to appear. He came home earlier. He helped me in the garden, trimming the roses and pulling weeds. One morning, he surprised me with breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, and a single flower in a small glass jar. I remembered you used to like this, he said, his voice shy. I laughed quietly. You mean 30 years ago? He smiled. Better late than never. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even consistent, but it was something. Then one evening, I found him in the living room, sitting with an old photo album on his lap. It was one I hadn't opened in years. He looked up when I entered. You kept everything, he said softly. I nodded. Every photo, every letter, every memory. He ran his fingers over a picture of our wedding day, me in my lace dress, him in his cheap but proud suit. We had nothing then, he said, but I think we were the richest we ever were. I sat beside him and whispered, because we had each other. He looked at me with a kind of sadness I'd never seen before. And I forgot that. I forgot you. For the first time, he didn't say it as an excuse. He said it like a confession. I didn't reply. I simply reached out and closed the album, resting my hand over his. Sometimes, silence says more than words ever can. The next morning, I woke up to find a note on the kitchen table. It said, I'm taking a day off. There's somewhere I want to take you. A few hours later, we drove out of town. The air was crisp, the sky clear. After an hour, we stopped by a small lake, the one we used to visit before Michael was born. The water shimmered under the sunlight, just as I remembered. He brought out a small picnic basket and smiled. Do you remember this place? Of course, I said. You proposed here? He nodded, looking out at the water. I was so sure I'd never forget that day, but somehow I did. He turned to me then, eyes wet but steady. I lost sight of what mattered, Evelyn. I thought success was love. I thought giving you comfort was enough. But you never wanted comfort. You wanted me. I felt tears welling up, but they weren't bitter. They were soft, like the kind that fall when a storm finally passes. I didn't stop loving you, I said quietly. I just stopped trying to remind you. He reached for my hand. Then let me remind you now. We sat there for hours, talking, really talking, about the past, about the mistakes, about the years we both let slip by. He told me things I'd never known, about the pressure he felt to provide, about how he thought I'd grown distant too, about how fear made him hide behind work. And for the first time, I realized something. It wasn't that he had stopped loving me. He had forgotten how to love me. He had forgotten the small ways, the everyday gestures that build a life. That night, when we came home, he asked me if I could forgive him. Not in a dramatic way, not through tears. Just a quiet question in the stillness of our kitchen. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said softly, "Forgiveness isn't a word, Richard. It's something you show, every day." He nodded. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life showing you." And he did try. He started leaving small notes around the house. "Have a good day, Eve." "You looked beautiful this morning." "Thank you for staying." At first, they felt strange, almost foreign, but after a while, I began to smile when I found them. He began calling Michael more often, too, repairing that bond piece by piece. One evening, the three of us had dinner together. Laughter, stories, the clinking of glasses. And I caught Richard looking at me across the table with the same softness he used to have. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was gentle, real, like love, learning how to breathe again. One night, weeks later, I woke up to find him sitting on the porch, staring at the stars. I joined him quietly, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. He said softly, "Do you think it's too late? For us, I mean." I looked up at the sky, the endless stretch of dark and light. "No," I said. "It's never too late to remember." He reached for my hand, and I let him hold it. The night air was cool, the world still. And in that quiet moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Because sometimes love doesn't end. It just waits, patiently, quietly, for two people to find their way back. After that night by the lake, things changed slowly, not suddenly, not like a movie where one scene fixes everything. It was a steady, careful unwrapping of old habits and the gentle building of new ones. Richard kept his promise in small ways. He began to notice the little things, the way I liked my tea, the songs I hummed while cooking, the mug I always chose. He left a note on the counter some mornings. "Thank you for last night," or "I enjoyed talking with you today." Those notes were small, but they warmed the house like sunlight. He also started to ask me questions again, simple ones at first. "How was your day? Do you need anything from the store?" Then deeper ones came later. "What do you miss about when we were first married? What would you like to try now?" I answered him honestly. I told him about the garden I wanted, the paintings I thought about, the books I'd been meaning to read. We made time for each other. Sunday mornings went from quiet routines to walks in the park together. We would hold hands without thinking about it, and sometimes we would talk about nothing, letting the silence feel soft instead of sharp. Those small rituals began to feel like stitches mending a torn cloth. Michael saw it too. He would call and say, "You both seem lighter." He'd laugh and add, "Maybe therapy actually helped." We all smiled at that, because a little humor made everything seem more human. Richard did go to counseling. At first he said he didn't need it, but then he went, quietly, without fanfare. He learned to name the stress that hid behind his excuses. He learned to say, "I'm sorry," and to mean it in a way that wasn't a quick fix, but the start of a practice. He learned to listen, not just to answer, but to understand. I changed too. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into the shape of our past. I took a painting class and discovered a love for watercolors. I joined a walking group at the local garden and helped plan a small neighborhood festival. These things gave me a quiet joy that did not depend on anyone's approval. We both learned to ask for help. There were days when old patterns tempted us, when he would withdraw, or I would hold back my feelings. Instead of letting it stew, we started saying, "I need you," or "I need some space," and it made the difference. Our words stopped being weapons and became bridges. One autumn evening, Richard surprised me with a small dinner at home. He cooked, something he had never done much of before, and the kitchen smelled of herbs and roasted vegetables. He set the table with the good plates and lit a candle. We ate slowly, talking about ordinary things that suddenly felt important. At the end of the meal, he reached across the table, took my hand and said, "Thank you for staying, for all you did when I didn't see." There was no drama in his voice, just steady, clear gratitude. We began to remember the small joys. We planted the herb garden I had wanted. Basil and rosemary filled the air. We painted a wall in the bedroom a gentle blue. We dug out old photo albums and spent an afternoon remembering the young couple we'd been. Laughter returned in pieces, sometimes at old mistakes, sometimes at how awkward we were at first trying to be kind. Forgiveness took time, but it arrived. It wasn't a sudden declaration, it was a steady acceptance. For me, forgiving Richard meant choosing to trust his actions over his past neglect. For him, it meant doing the daily work to show he had changed. There were moments that tested us. An argument over money, an older memory rekindled by a song on the radio. Sometimes we stumbled. We said things we later regretted. But mostly we returned to each other, to the table, to the porch where we watched sunrises together again. Michael became part of it in his own way. He visited more often, bringing news and jokes and stories about his life. One weekend he came with a friend and helped fix the old fence. When he left, he hugged both of us, and I felt that warmth, the family I had known slowly re-knitting itself. The neighborhood noticed too. Neighbors would comment on how we were often seen walking together, how the garden looked happier. People don't always talk about marriage matters, but they watch when a couple begins to care for each other again. And that quiet approval felt good, not because we needed their validation, but because it reminded us our choices mattered beyond our walls. We began celebrating small things, not huge parties, just simple acknowledgments. A cake for the day we first moved into our house, a note on our anniversary, an extra hour spent talking over tea. These acts were gentle promises we kept to each other. One winter afternoon, Richard took my hand and said, "I want to go through the old letters you saved." We sat with boxes of paper and photographs, reading silly notes and clumsy poems. We read the years aloud to each other, and sometimes we cried. Tears were no longer a sign of failure for us. They were the salt of healing. There was one night, late in spring, that felt like a turning point. We had been working in the garden all day, planting new perennials and setting up a small bird bath. We ended the day with lemonade on the porch. He turned to me and said, "I used to think I should buy you things to show my love. I see now it's the time that matters." I smiled and rested my head on his shoulder. Time is what we have, and we're using it. It wasn't all romantic. The romance had softened into companionship, a quieter, sturdier thing, and it fit us better now than any grand gesture ever would have. As months turned into a year, people began to ask us about the change. "How did you do it?" friends asked. There was no single answer. We said, we wanted to try. Sometimes that's all a relationship needs, two people deciding to try again. I watched Richard become more present. He would sit with me while I painted, asking questions about colors and light. He began to call his mother more often. He apologized to people he had brushed off. His gestures were imperfect but real. I saw a change in how he looked at me, no longer as someone who did things for him automatically, but as a companion who had chosen life alongside him. He noticed my small victories and celebrated them without being asked. One evening, Michael came over with news. He would be getting married soon. We were surprised and delighted. The house filled with plans and laughter. There was a new energy in the rooms, the kind that comes when families prepare for more life to enter them. As the wedding day approached, Richard knocked himself out preparing. He helped assemble decorations. He met the caterer. He even helped Michael with his speech. He moved through the days with a care that made me proud. Watching him with our son, I felt something like gratitude and relief braided together. The wedding was small and warm. We stood together at the altar of a backyard gazebo decorated with strings of lights and wildflowers. When Michael said his vows, he looked at us both with a tenderness that made the old ache in my chest soften completely. After the ceremony, Richard pulled me close and whispered, We did it. I laughed then, a full laugh, and felt the truth of it. We had weathered, learned, and returned. Life after the wedding felt full. New faces, new stories, new routines. We welcomed a daughter-in-law who was kind and caring, and who learned quickly that family is built with small acts. We celebrated birthdays and holidays with a newfound ease. No one pretended the past had not been painful, but we let it be a part of the story that made the present sweeter. There were times when I would catch Richard watching me, not with the distracted glance of before, but with attention. He'd observe how my hands moved when I mixed paint, or how I read to a visiting child, and I would meet his gaze and sometimes nod, feeling seen. Forgiveness had settled like a soft blanket over many nights of grief. It did not erase what had happened, but it warmed the cold edges. On a quiet Thursday, he surprised me with a small album he had made. Inside, he'd written notes beside the photos, small observations about each moment we had shared. He had sifted through our history and chosen to say thank you in a way I had not expected. I kept that album on the coffee table. Sometimes, when evenings were long and the world felt a little complicated, I would open it and read his words. They reminded me of how far we had come and what it takes to choose love every day. We still had hard moments, old habits are stubborn, but when they returned, we used the tools we had learned, the small talks, the apologies, the notes, the hands held in the dark. We had learned that marriage is not a finish line, but a practice. One summer evening, as fireflies blinked in the garden, Richard took my hand and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I looked at him, at the weathered face I had loved for decades, and I said, "We didn't give up on each other." We smiled, and in that smile was all the quiet work we had done, the tending, the daily acts, the promises kept. Forgiveness and reunion did not come as a miracle. They came as a choice, again and again. We learned to see each other, to speak, to listen, and to act with care. And in the steady days that followed, we found a new kind of joy, one rooted in the knowledge that even after forgetting, it is possible to remember and to love again.